Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by return guest and Jim Dempsey. Jim, thanks for being here.
Hey, just really great to be here. Been too long.
Yeah, I always enjoy chatting with you. I learned quite a bit, and you've been on the show. I think this is your third time now, but for folks that didn't catch you the first or second time, can you tell us a bit about your background?
Well, whenever I talk about cybersecurity, I always start out by saying I'm a lawyer. I'm not a technologist. Over the years, I feel like I've learned a lot about the technology, but really I look at these issues from a legal and policy perspective. I teach a course in cybersecurity law to the LLMs at University of California, Berkeley Law School. I do research and writing on cybersecurity issues for the Stanford program on geopolitics, technology, and governance. And most recently, I have become managing director of the Cybersecurity Law Center, newly launched Cybersecurity Law Center at the IAPP organization many people know as the International Association of Privacy Professionals. So we can save that for the end and talk a little bit about the IAPP Cybersecurity Law Center.
Sounds great. And I'm actually going to send you an article, the way you framed that around the lawyer background, the legal background. I actually just read a paper and an article someone wrote. I think it was called "Blessed Are the Lawyers, for They Will Inherit Cybersecurity." I think if you haven't read it, you'll find it very interesting.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like in our society, pretty much any maturing issue has a legal and regulatory framework around it. But I've always very much believed that lawyers and technologists need to understand each other's language. They need to be able to talk to each other. I think technologists have an obligation to understand just a little bit of the technological terminology. They don't want to try to practice law, but they need to be able to communicate. And the same with lawyers. You would never want to ask me to touch your network, let alone even to get your computer working if it's not working. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to try to do that. But I have tried to understand, and there are many other lawyers in the technology field, including in the cybersecurity field, who've made a lot of effort to try to understand what are the underlying technologies, how do they work, and then how can we shape the law to be compatible with the technology.
Yeah, I think that's really well framed. And I'll say from my side, I think, from the security practitioner side of things, there's no doubt a benefit of starting to understand the legal landscape and the law a bit better, especially with things like software liability and, SEC rules and things like that. We need to be able to kind of converse and understand these things. And then I personally am thankful that, folks like you make the effort to learn a bit about the technology, because I think a lot of us, on the practitioner side, on the cyber side, have seen many, regulations, policies, requirements that we say, who the hell wrote this? This isn't how this technology works, or something like that. So I think it's beneficial. So I wanted to ask you, fresh out the gate, the hottest question, I think a lot of people are wondering, given, what's going on right now, is, there's a forthcoming administration change, right? And I'm curious what you see, on the horizon as you look at this. There's a lot of parallels. I think you probably have written about this, but parallels between, Trump's first term, Biden's term, and things like that. But there's also some rumblings around a major emphasis around, particularly changes for CISA, perhaps, or just kind of an overarching theme of deregulation. And I'm curious, like, what does that mean for some of the things that we've been doing the last few years here?
Yeah. Well, it's a very complex picture. Cybersecurity has long been a very complex field. First of all, you would have to say right out of the box that it's hard to fully predict what will happen with the new administration. Obviously, cybersecurity was not a major theme of the campaign. President-elect Trump did not, I think, speak at all during the campaign. Neither party spoke during the campaign to cybersecurity. Secondly, of course, there's the old saying that personnel is policy. So a lot is going to depend upon who the incoming President Trump, will nominate and put in key positions. So obviously, who will be the head of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, who will be the National Cyber Director. Congress, by statute, created within the Executive Office of the President, within the White House, the Office of the National Cyber Director. And it'll be very interesting to see who Trump taps for that position. Now, with that said, and I think a little bit you alluded to this, Chris, a lot of what has happened in the Biden administration has actually, on cybersecurity, particularly with respect to critical infrastructure, but also with respect to data, has been a continuation or a expansion and implementation of things that actually began during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. Trump issued a very wide-ranging executive order 13873 on information and communications technology supply chains. And President Biden kept that order in place, did not repeal it. And actually, President Biden invoked that order and expanded upon it in some of the cybersecurity measures that he took. Now, there's another piece to this, of course, which is, what lens do you view cybersecurity through? In other words, is cybersecurity a consumer protection issue? Well, if you're talking about personal information, yes. If you're talking about data breaches, ransomware, identity theft, criminal hackers, credit card data, identity fraud, yes, it's a consumer protection issue. And a Republican administration, you would expect, would be anti-regulatory there, or would be more pro-business and less inclined to regulate. Now, this is not necessarily going to be your typical Republican administration, so you can't sort of count too much there, but you would expect a sort of a deregulatory trend when you look at cybersecurity through the consumer privacy or consumer protection lens. On the other hand, is cybersecurity a national security issue? Well, yes, of course it is. And in that regard, you would expect from a Republican administration a relatively robust approach. Clearly, the nation-state attackers have become a major concern, as cybersecurity, in a way, has evolved from being a focus, an outgrowth of privacy law and a focus on protecting personal information, to now adding on top of that all of the national security concerns. And obviously, you see the 3 or 4 major adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, all highly active. And on question of critical infrastructure, we know that the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians have all infiltrated and been active inside U.S. critical infrastructures. So that would suggest a more robust approach. And actually, if you look at the Republican Party platform, now platforms don't matter all that much. What a party says in its platform isn't necessarily going to bind the president, and probably this one, President Trump, is not going to be feel bound by anything in the platform. But the platform did say, the last sentence on the last page of the Republican Party platform says that the Republicans will use, quote, all tools of national power to protect our nation's critical infrastructure and industrial base from malicious cyber actors. And it goes on to pledge, quote, to raise the security standards for our critical systems and networks. So all tools and raising security standards sounds potentially regulatory. And, you know, and one other thing, and then we can circle back around on this, Chris, but one other thing, remember the states. The states have become increasingly active on cybersecurity, at least some of them. New York, particularly, and California, but Texas has an active Attorney General's office. And I think we will continue to see private litigation. Now, litigation, class action litigation, is a blunt instrument at best, and not a good way, really, to obtain legal reform. But still, there are almost all the cybersecurity litigation is based upon the common law, state law, common law dating back hundreds of years, negligence law particularly. So the class actions and data breaches will continue. And I think the states will continue to be active. New York State, for example, has a major cybersecurity regulation for financial sector, which also covers insurance companies. And just recently, the New York State issued a cybersecurity regulation for hospitals. And we had seen rumblings from the Biden administration that they wanted to do something on hospital cybersecurity, and they never got there. If they put out anything in the next month or so, it's not going to go anywhere. So New York State jumped ahead, and New York State has now, obviously just for hospitals operating in New York, but I think you will continue to see state action. 37 states now have laws, I think it's 37, certainly more than half, have laws requiring data custodians, companies that collect personal data, to apply reasonable cybersecurity measures to protect that data. And most of those laws are enforceable. All of the laws are enforceable by the state attorneys general. So complicated picture, hard to predict. Very hard to predict.
Yeah, I mean, so a general consensus from my perspective, the way you kind of teed that up is it really aligns with the way I think it's going to play out. There's no denying a few things that you touched on there. First off is that the states are going to continue to do what the states are doing, which is going to bring us to our next question about the complexity of what that brings. But also, there's no denying the role that the tech sector and Silicon Valley has played in this administration and their platform and things like that, from, people, advocating for a certain candidate and things like that as well. So I think we are going to see maybe a deregulatory movement, or at least a less emphasis around consumer privacy advocacy, some of that maybe by big tech, for example. But there's also a tighter and tighter relationship, even under the current administration, when it comes to Silicon Valley, big tech and the defense industry. That's kind of a growing trend that I've been noticing, in particular with Defense Innovation Unit and others more broadly. So I think that we'll see that, play out, as well as the role of cybersecurity when it comes to national security. And especially with these type of individuals involved in the administration who are tech savvy and understand the role of cyber as kind of a pillar of warfare, for lack of another way to put it.
Exactly. And, you've covered on your show many times the CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification process. That's not going away. That's not going to be derailed. In fact, it was in progress during the Trump administration. Elements of that actually predate Trump administration pushed it forward. Now, finally, it's coming across the line and will finally come into play. So don't expect CMMC to be somehow deregulated or subject to this deregulatory effort. I was just looking back at Project 2025, the famous Heritage Foundation document, 900 pages. First of all, there's actually not a lot about cybersecurity in Project 2025. Again, it hasn't been a major focus politically, campaign-wise. A few blockbusters in there, particularly on CISA. But one thing, for example, is it actually called for a reissuance of a Trump order on the electric power grid. So near to the end of his administration, first term, President Trump issued an executive order on the electric power grid, specifically aimed at China-made equipment. And there is a huge amount of Chinese-made equipment in our electric power grid. just as there used to be, and to some extent still is a little bit, in our telecommunications infrastructure. And obviously, again, across administrations and on a bipartisan basis, Congress and the administrations, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, moved forward with a major effort, an expensive effort, to rip and replace the Huawei switches that were pretty good and were inexpensive, less expensive than Western-made switches, but that were subject to possible manipulation or control or cyber attack by the Chinese government. So we launched and are continuing, and it's still in progress, and it's very expensive, this major effort to tear out and replace all of those Chinese-made switches in the telecommunications backbone. Trump, and again, that's didn't start with Trump, it really started with Congress, but Trump pushed it along with his own executive orders and efforts on that. At the end of his term, near to the end of his term, Trump issued a parallel order addressing a similar problem in the electric power grid, which was this huge number of Chinese-made components, huge pieces of equipment at the core of our electrical infrastructure. Of course, equipment which is internet connected, equipment which has a digital as well as physical operational technology component. And President Biden repealed that order. And I was just looking again this morning in preparation for this show, Chris, and in Project 2025, which again may or may not be the defining document, there's a call to reinstitute that repealed Trump order on the electric power grid, to address, among other things, the China-made switches. Will that go forward or not? I don't know. But again, it's an example of how there's a difference between deregulation and hands-off. And I think this administration, this incoming administration, is likely to be very hands-on when it comes to critical infrastructure. One other example, cranes. 80% of the ship-to-shore cranes at American ports, critical choke point for our economy, 80% of the cranes have been made in China. All of those cranes, of course, have digital components to them. All of them are internet connected. And therefore, all of them are subject to cyber attack, including cyber attack by China. To the extent that they receive upgrades, you could see a scenario in which the Chinese government forces the manufacturer of the crane to include a cyber vulnerability in the next upgrade, in the next automatic update to the software that's in the cranes. The Biden administration, and the problem is there's nowhere else currently to go to buy replacement cranes. So rip and replace was not an option for the ship-to-shore cranes. The Biden administration a couple months ago issued a series of orders aimed at the port facility operators, requiring them to adopt risk mitigation strategies to address the cyber vulnerabilities of those cranes. So, and that's not, I couldn't conceive of a Trump administration somehow saying, oh no, let's repeal that order. Those cranes are critical to our economic security, our national security, and they are vulnerable to China.
Yep. Yeah, it makes sense. So many things you touched on there that I think, could be an entire conversation of their own right. I recently had the CTO of Palantir on, and he talked about, the deepening divide between the defense industrial base and then the broader economy. And he said we need to move back towards an American industrial base where we do manufacture some of these things that we now critically depend on countries that may not have our best interest in mind, right? That produce some of these things and then have the potential for activities across critical infrastructure. And we've seen so much focus from CISA of, things like Volt Typhoon and living off the land attacks. And in terms of our critical infrastructure and its vulnerability. So I hope that type of stuff continues. I do want to take us to our next question I had for you was, you talked about the state, and you've been writing quite a bit about, what you call a patchwork quilt of compliance or regulation, as you framed it. And you've talked about infrastructure and data. And for folks not familiar, this is a series that Jim has been publishing at Lawfare. So I'll be sure to share that in the show notes as well. Really great articles to check out. But can you unpack that topic a bit? What do you mean by this patchwork quilt, and what is it exactly?
Yeah. So with cybersecurity, broadly speaking, we've taken a patchwork quilt approach, a sectoral approach, and it has a three-dimensionality to it, because you've got sector by sector at the federal level, but then you've also got sector by sector or issue by issue at the state level. So we've got federal regulation and state regulation. And we have, we've long had for banks under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which goes back to late 1990s, a requirement that banks adopt cybersecurity measures to protect their customer data, bank financial data. We have the HIPAA security rule for health data of hospitals, healthcare providers, and insurers under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. We've got a set of requirements under the Energy Policy Act for the bulk electric power system, the so-called NERC, National Electric Reliability Council, cyber critical infrastructure protection standards. We've got the Nuclear Regulatory Agency has its set of rules. The SEC is now in there. As I said, with the cranes, that's the Coast Guard actually has authority over security of ports. We have the Federal Communications Commission implementing the Rip and Replace program for the Huawei switches within the telecommunications backbone. Now we've got a major new rule making underway and likely to be finished before the end of the Biden administration on data brokers and flows of sensitive data of Americans. The Chinese, of course, broke into Office of Personnel Management more than a decade ago and stole huge amounts of data, my data from the time when I was a federal government employee, my data and the data of lots of other people. The Chinese stole it. But what if they can just buy all of that data from the data brokers? So while we're trying to close the back door, what about the fact that the front door is open? So we're going to be regulating data brokers and flows of sensitive data of Americans and data about government personnel, going to be regulating those data flows to China and other adversaries. So you can see we've got, this is why I say the patchwork quilt. One set of rules for the electric grid, one set of rules for the nuclear power plants, one set of rules for sensitive data flows, one set of rules for financial data, one set of rules for health data. Nothing really at the federal level regulating the operational technology of the hospitals. All of the focus there is on, so it's a patchwork quilt, but it's got these huge gaps. So the hospitals are required to protect the patient data that they hold, but they're under no legal mandate to ensure that the internet connected medical equipment is working correctly and is not vulnerable. So the adversary or a ransomware gang could do significant damage, not by attacking the data, but by attacking the equipment. Yet there's no regulation on the cybersecurity of the equipment. And now again, almost every piece of equipment, except for a stethoscope and maybe even them, pretty much every significant piece of equipment at a hospital has a digital connected component to it, making it vulnerable to attack. So that's what I mean by the patchwork quilt. And, you want to talk about harmonization, and let me jump to that. So everybody sees this patchwork quilt, and people say, this is crazy. Why do we have one set of rules for banks and one set of rules for hospitals and one set of rules for data and one set of rules for operational technology, or nothing for up here? Shouldn't we harmonize? I think people need to be honest about harmonization. I don't want harmonization to be used as a term for deregulation. I am simultaneously supportive of and skeptical of regulation. I think we do need more regulation. I think we do have a market failure on cybersecurity. And I do, at some level, bemoan this crazy quilt. I have a whole book, Cybersecurity Law Fundamentals, in which I try to explain it all and pierce it together. And already you can see I've got all these tabs. The book just came out in the spring, and already I've got all these tabs of things that I need to update. But there's a reason why we do have these differences. Banks are different from nuclear power plants. It's often industry itself that is pushing for, hey, that doesn't work for us. We need our own rule. Or, hey, you don't understand our technology. Our technology is different from that sector's technology. We need a different set of rules. And at the end of the day, Chris, we're not going to have one massive monster cyber regulatory agency, and I don't think we want one. I don't think we could staff one. Therefore, the enforcement of these rules will fall to the sector-specific agencies. You're going to have the bank regulators who, after all, send inspectors into the banks, examiners, to look at all risks and all hazards and to assess the sort of security, reliability, and stability of the banks across a whole range of threats. And for years now, cybersecurity has been included in those bank regulatory exams. And I think that's appropriate. Cyber is huge, but it's not the only issue that any of these critical infrastructures face. It's not the only risk that they face. Risky investments can bring down a bank as well as a foreign attacker. So in my opinion, you're always going to have sector by sector regulation. To take one example, and again, I'm not saying harmonization is a bad idea, and I'm not saying the effort to harmonize is wrong. Absolutely, because you look at some of these regulations, and one of them requires cybersecurity training for employees, and the other doesn't mention cybersecurity training, and you say, well, certainly banks and nuclear power plants both should have cybersecurity training. So there are weird differences in these sectoral regulations that don't make sense. Their approach to multi-factor authentication, or the concept of zero trust, and some of the regulations embrace zero trust and some of them don't mention zero trust, and you wonder, well, why? So some of those differences make no sense. But take one example, Chris, incident reporting and breach notification. So regulators have gone crazy in the last 5 years around the concept of breach notice and incident reporting. It was a little bit like, the guy with the hammer, every problem's a nail. The regulators with the concept of breach notice, all of cybersecurity became a matter of breach notice. On the other hand, if you look at it, each one of these makes sense. So you've got the breach notice rules for breach of personal data. All 50 states have them, and many of the sectoral regulators have adopted breach notice requirements. Some of the state laws have deadlines. I don't know anybody has a deadline shorter than 30 days, and all of them talk in terms of reasonably, promptly, and taking into account the need of the investigators who might be conducting a criminal or other forensic investigation. Those breach notice rules have one purpose, and that is to alert the consumer to protect themselves. They are intended to say to the consumers, your data has been stolen, watch your credit reports, watch your bank account, watch out for ID theft. So the theory there was, the horse is out of the barn, you, the consumer, need to engage in some self-help here, and you need to be alert. So the purpose of the breach notification is to alert the consumer. Now we have an SEC rule, Securities and Exchange Commission rule. Completely different purpose to that rule. That rule says investors deserve to know about the stability and financial integrity and prospects of the companies that they are considering investing in. And our whole securities regulation system in the United States for publicly traded companies is based upon a disclosure rule. That is, the investor should know what the profit and loss statement is, and they need to know that on a timely basis, and they need to know about major material events that might affect the financial desirability of a particular publicly traded company as a potential investment. So we have now public notification with a 4-day rule, but the 4 days, that's the same rule that applies if your distribution center or your major factory gets hit by an earthquake, or the tornado tears the roof off of your major distribution facility and stops your distribution network, or if there's a major fire or whatever, you are required to inform potential investors through a public disclosure within 4 days. And the SEC has said cyber should be the same. If there has been a material cybersecurity incident, which is going to have a bottom line impact on your financial stability and your desirability as an investment, let investors know within 4 days. Then you've got another rule, the CIRCIA, Critical Infrastructure Reporting, whatever Act, I can't remember now what it stands for, which is the still in progress rulemaking at the Department of Homeland Security. That one will require reporting, sometimes on a relatively short 24 or 48 hour, I forget, but it's even less than 4 days. Reporting to DHS, to CISA, of a material cyber event or ransomware payment. That has a completely, those reports are confidential. They're not public. They are not intended to help consumers protect themselves. They're not intended to inform investors about the risks of a particular publicly traded company. They're intended to inform the government at the national level in order to be able to see what is happening, particularly with critical infrastructure, and what attacks may be underway, so that Duke Energy gets hit on the East Coast, but then a day later, PG&E on the West Coast, Pacific Gas and Electric, gets hit. You've got to have somebody be able to put those two things together and to begin to coordinate a national response if it starts looking like a coordinated attack. And you need to be able to have somebody in the middle who can tell all of the utilities, hey, watch out. Duke got hit, PG&E got hit, you may be next. That's what the CERCIA reporting is about. Completely different function. Now, I don't see how you can possibly harmonize those reporting requirements when they serve fundamentally different purposes and fit within fundamentally different pre-existing regulatory schemes. If the SEC has a 4-day rule for all other information of all other material events, should it have a different rule for cyber? I don't think so. Why would it have 4 days for everything else and 6 days for cyber? Meanwhile, are you saying that CISA should not get quick notice of events that may have national consequences, attacks on critical infrastructure? Are you going to say, well, consumers shouldn't know when their data has been stolen by ransomware attackers or by criminals and maybe being monetized, and consumers need to protect themselves because we're never going to reel the data back in? So to me, that's the challenge of harmonization. People say, oh, all these requirements, well, they're all there for different purposes, and it's hard to say, oh, there should be only one rule.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem because, there's no perfect answer. Like, how much is too much? How little is too little? What's the sweet spot? It's complicated because there are differences. And many of us, on the cyber side who've worked in different industries, from defense to, critical infrastructure to commercial tech, like it's just different. It's different, healthcare, et cetera. It's all different. One thing I did like that you said is, that cyber is but one risk among many that organizations consider. I recently wrote an article titled "The Cybersecurity Delusion Problem," because often in my space, it feels like my peers sometimes we think all that matters is cyber. It's like, hey, well, the business has all these other considerations, like you said, a bad investment. They have a financial runway. They have all these other things that they're considering from a risk perspective beyond just cyber. And I think that cyber can go a long way to understand some of those risks and communicate in that broader discussion. I also wanted to ask you, you've been writing and talking about some emerging directives and initiatives in the EU. I think it's titled NIS2, which talks about the concept of liability for software products. Obviously we had the concept of software liability come up recently. I think it was the National Cyber Strategy where it had a pretty prominent emphasis here in the US, but it hasn't materialized quite yet, right? You called it software's third rail. The EU seems to be, touching that rail directly at this point. What exactly is this directive and what does it mean?
Well, as we know, on a host of issues, the EU has taken a very different path than the US has. Obviously, with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, it has comprehensive union-wide regulation of privacy. And on cybersecurity, and by the way, the GDPR has a cybersecurity clause in it requiring custodians of data controllers and processors to adopt reasonable security measures to protect the personal data they hold. But going beyond just the privacy roots of cybersecurity and looking at cybersecurity instead as a critical infrastructure and national stability and national security issue, the EU is pursuing a very, very aggressive, comprehensive approach to cybersecurity. As I said, I'm sort of pro-regulation, but I cannot support I just what is going on in the EU. I just don't see how it's going to work. They have bitten off so much at once. So, Chris, you mentioned NIS, NIS2, Network and Information Systems 2. This is a EU-wide directive which took effect in October and is now being implemented by the 27 member states of the EU. It's a directive, not a regulation, meaning that each nation state, each of the 27 members of the EU has to adopt its own implementing law. NIS2, as the acronym suggests, Network and Information Systems. It focuses on the information systems in close to 24, probably about 18 critical sectors: energy, space, food production, chemicals, communications, banking, healthcare, and a lot of ICT, information and communications technology services, both things critical to the backbone of the internet, the domain name system, the domain name registries, communications service providers, online marketplaces, search engines, online content hosts, platforms, social media platforms, regulating a wide range of entities, not focused on the protection of personal information, but focused on the operational resiliency of those entities. And it requires regulated entities, which are any entities in those sectors that are more than medium size or larger. Anybody, I think, with 50 employees or more, to adopt, again, reasonable or appropriate and proportionate cybersecurity measures to protect the data. And the mandate, the directive, specifies 10 factors that companies must consider in adopting their cybersecurity policies, and then it tasks the member states with implementing and enforcing those requirements, including inspections authority, audit authority, and the authority to issue mandatory orders to companies to take certain cybersecurity measures to improve their cybersecurity protections. So that's focused on these critical sectors and their information systems and networks. That's NIST 2. There's a separate directive, so-called DORA, specifically focused on the financial sector. There's another directive, the Radio Equipment Directive, focused on mobile phones and other wireless devices. There's another directive just adopted last month, again in October, the Cyber Resilience Act. It's the Cyber Resilience Act that focuses on hardware and software security. And that would impose some form of liability on developers of software and hardware. There's also a proposal, which will probably go forward, on the so-called Cyber Solidarity Act, which deals with information sharing. There's the Cybersecurity Act in the EU, which sets up ENISA, which is the European Union Cybersecurity Coordinating Agency, and also sets up a voluntary system of certification for ICT products. So, really crazy. DORA for financial services resilience. GDPR already regulates all data, personal data. GDPR, personal data. DORA, operational resistance of a financial sector. Something called CER on the resilience of other critical entities. A Cyber Resilience Act on hardware and software. Another act on radio-based products. I don't know how they're going to. I mean, talk about harmonization.
I was going to say,
harmonization.
We got to be, careful what we wish for, and given it could be, they have a really complex landscape. It sounds like over there, far more than what we're dealing with here. And actually, it's like why I wanted to ask you this next question is, contrasting that with the current and likely future landscape we talked about here in the U.S. obviously is drastically different. Here we're hearing a ton of deregulation, including around AI, whereas in EU they're taking a much more rigorous and regulation driven approach. Each has its pros and cons, including like safety, security, and innovation trade-offs. I also read in the last, I think it was almost last 20 years, the U.S. economy has grown like 50% more than the entire collective EU economy, or some statistic like that, right? Showing the drastic difference in growth. And even the French president, I think he had used the phrase, the EU, quote unquote, could die or would die if it didn't change this regulatory driven approach that it has right now. And then I've seen other metrics around the number of, tech startups here in the US versus the EU, just, kind of like a lot of ancillary kind of metrics like that. What are your thoughts on these two different approaches? Because on one hand, we know that, there's a market failure, right? We can't have no regulation when it comes to cybersecurity and digital products. We have to address this. But on the other hand, the proof is in the pudding that it could lead to economic slowdown and so on, and maybe perhaps, ramifications like that.
Yeah. I don't think we're I don't think the US is anywhere close to the EU. And I don't see a major risk in the United States that the kinds of things that we're pursuing would impede innovation, at least on the cybersecurity side. I won't speak on the AI side. But I do think, and I think there's probably some growing evidence that the EU approach has impeded innovation and economic development. There was a report, in addition to the comments by the French president, there was a report a couple months ago chaired by Mario Draghi, Italian prime minister, former Italian prime minister, but also sort of a supporter of the EU, a supporter of the sort of European project, so to speak. But Draghi and the folks working on that report concluded that the regulatory structure in the tech sector, particularly in Europe, had impeded innovation there and had impeded economic growth. So I think it's now one thing to recognize, Chris, of course, is the so-called Brussels effect. What has been the most important privacy law for American-based, US-based corporations over the past 10 years? The EU's GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. Mm-hmm. Every US company that has any global aspirations, any global footprint, any presence in Europe, any customers in Europe, any users in Europe collecting data on European citizens, that US-based company is subject to EU regulation. And I think we are seeing the Brussels effect now coming to cybersecurity, so that NIS2 directive and all of those sectors that are covered, it applies to entities operating in the EU. And you don't have to be headquartered in the EU, and you don't have to be incorporated in an EU country in order to be subject to EU regulation. And so US-based global companies headquartered anywhere in the world, but that have significant operations in Europe, may well be subject to that NIS2 directive. But yeah, I just cannot support the approach of EU, and I don't think we're anywhere close to that in the United States. And let me say, can I say one other thing, Chris, on innovation? I strongly support innovation. I've been a proponent of tech innovation sort of my entire career. But sometimes the people saying, "Oh, don't regulate us, it will impede innovation," are the very people who aren't innovating. You sometimes hear, "Oh, this will delay innovation." Well, what about memory safe languages? Okay, some of the people complaining that regulation would impede innovation are the people who are still using memory unsafe languages and are refusing to innovate and adopt memory safe languages, which are available. And if we made an innovative shift from the use of C and C++ and other memory unsafe languages, if we innovated and began using the memory safe languages, entire classes of cyber vulnerabilities would be eliminated. So always be careful and take just one step behind the argument, regulation will impede innovation. Sometimes the people making that argument are the people who are in fact not innovating and just want to protect the same old way of doing business.
Yeah, actually, that's actually what I was going to chime in with. A couple of things on that note is, like, first off, to your point about getting people fluent in technology who drive policy. That memory safe, like, that's a good example. We need people writing policy that understand things that could have a systemic wide benefit and make sense and are good ideas and things like that, versus things that maybe are too regulatory cumbersome and not well, they're not going to work out well, right? Because they don't understand the technology. And then the other piece is sometimes I've seen regulation being advocated for by certain, tech companies and organizations who are looking to use it as a moat rather than they're not interested in necessarily safety, security, other than, their own financial safety, security as an organization versus other, as an incumbent versus disruptors trying to break into a sector.
Exactly.
Yep. So I wanted to ask you, we're coming up on time here. I wanted to ask you, the last question I had for you was, you recently took a role as a managing director at the Cyber Law Center within IAPP, which I believe is a brand new initiative, within the organization. Can you tell us a bit about what that is, what you guys are looking to accomplish and where folks can learn more as well?
Yeah. So IAPP.org. IAPP used to stand for International Association of Privacy Professionals. It's a global organization. I think it has 80,000 plus members. It's a certification granting organization, training, education, information sharing, networking. It had, as its name used to suggest, had grown up and out of the privacy arena and supporting this now widely global profession of cyber people working on privacy and working on privacy compliance. And it has recently expanded, it really responding to developments in the marketplace and in the technology and in corporate structures, has expanded to include AI governance and cybersecurity law and policy. Because really at organizations, if you're talking about data and data governance and monetization and responsible use of data and how you structure those things within an organization, artificial intelligence is part of that, traditional privacy is part of that, and cybersecurity is clearly now part of that. And so IAPP launched about a year ago a AI governance center. And then just this past September, just 2 months ago, it launched the Cybersecurity Law Center and asked me to be the part-time managing director of that. And our focus is on content. IAPP is not an advocacy organization. It doesn't take positions. It's a neutral forum for information, education, professionalization, networking, and basically we're working to produce more content on the website. IAPP publishes my book on cybersecurity law fundamentals. I write a lot at Lawfare still, but I also am writing more at the IAPP website. I'm encouraging all IAPP members and even non-members really to contribute pieces globally. What's happening in Brazil, what's happening in Mexico, what's happening in China, Singapore, South Korea, Australia. A lot going on, obviously, on cybersecurity worldwide, in addition to the US and the EU. And then at our major summit in DC in April, we're going to have a day-long workshop on cybersecurity law. And then we're also aiming to have a half-day workshop at RSA, which will also be in April, of the last week of April in San Francisco. RSA, the major cybersecurity technology and policy conference. So I'm really proud to be associated with them. It's a phenomenal team, just an amazing group of people. And we just did, actually, talking about NIST 2, just 2 days ago, the 12th, 3 days ago, we did a webinar, which is now available on LinkedIn, not members and non-members alike. Anybody can watch it. We did an hour-long webinar on NIST 2 and had two fantastic lawyers join me, one an in-house counsel and one a lawyer based in Germany, walking through the basics on NIST 2 and its implications for global companies. And in fact, in December, I'm going to be doing another webinar also looking at the contrast between EU and US. So very exciting. Very exciting.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll be tuning into that one for sure. Thanks for throwing that out there. And for folks that you are following along here, you can catch Jim on LinkedIn. You can catch him on the Cyber Lawfare site. You can catch him on the IAPP Cybersecurity Law Center, as he talked about, where they're doing a lot of events around different regulations, different contrasts of approaches between nations and regions. He obviously has his Cybersecurity Law Fundamentals book to check out as well, which I have a copy of. And Jim, thank you so much for coming on again. I learn a lot every time we talk, and I always appreciate these conversations.
Always fun, Chris. Always fun.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who tuned in as well.
Take care.